Welcome to the Heirloom Farmer. Today I am in our kitchen and I want to show you how to process one of our heirloom pie pumpkins. A lot of people can be intimidated by the prospect of taking a pumpkin and turning it into puree to use in a pie or other desserts, but it's really pretty simple. So I just want to walk you through today how to do that. You can find the directions, the typed directions, in our farm stand along with a pie recipe, and we have also shared them on social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at the Heirloom Farmer. So I'm going to show you what to do with this pie pumpkin. This is a large pie pumpkin. It's about 11 pounds, and you can see behind me an extra large pumpkin. It's over 20 pounds. But most of the sizes that we have are around this size. This is a good size to start with. So I'm going to use this one for demonstration purposes today. Again, this is about 11 pounds. And this is an heirloom pie pumpkin. So it's grown based on characteristics that make it excellent for purees for a wide range of uses. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure the pumpkin is clean. Just make sure that there's no dirt on it. You can wash it off. We do wash our pumpkins before they're put in our farm stand, so it should be clean. But we recommend just washing it off with water to make sure it's clean before you get started. And then place it on a cutting board, and you do need a sharp knife. As you're gonna see, they're not the easiest to cut open. But what you're going to do is you're gonna cut it in half in what I call the middle. So this end is where the stem connects. This is the blossom end of the pumpkin, where the blossom was when it was growing. And you're gonna wanna cut it in the middle. So go ahead and take your sharp knife and carefully cut down through the pumpkin, similar to like how you might cut a watermelon in half. They're not quite as hard to cut as like a butternut squash or some other squash, but they're still pretty tricky. See, that wasn't too bad. So you're gonna cut it in half and you'll see the guts of the pumpkin, or the insides of the pumpkin, which is where you're gonna have your seeds and some other stringy goop. And that's what you wanna do next, is remove the inside piece. So you can see here, this is the flesh of the pumpkin. This is the guts of the pumpkin. And the flesh of the pumpkin is what we cook down to use for puree. So I just get a spoon and work around the flesh and the goop and separate it with a knife. You can, or with a spoon. You can reach in with your hands. But I like to start going around the edge first to separate the flesh and the guts, and then I'll start pulling those out. And I will set these aside in a bowl because then I go through and save the seeds. You can set them aside and save the seeds, or you can put them in your compost. If you throw them in your compost pile, you may end up with volunteer pumpkins next year, which is always fun. And then I just keep scraping around. You don't want to scrape the flesh off, but this kind of the spongy, goopy inside, you want to scoop all of that out. And then you're left with the shell of the flesh. And then you'll just do the same thing with the other half. Now the large pumpkins that we have in our farm stand range from anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds. That can make anywhere from 5 to 8 pies typically. And a pie takes 2 cups of pumpkin puree. So this pumpkin, like I said, it's 11 pounds. My guess is we'll get about 5 to 6 pies worth, or 10 to 12 cups of pumpkin puree. I did a pumpkin the other day that was more like the size of the one behind me, and I actually got 9 pies worth of pumpkin. So that was a lot. All right, so now I have both of them cleaned out inside pretty well. So what I do next is I place them on a baking tray that has about a 1-inch edge or a 1-inch lip on it. And you place them cut side down. Just like that. And then what I do is I put a little bit of water on the tray, not a lot, just enough so that there's some moisture on it, and it may not actually be necessary, but that's just what I do to prevent scorching of the pumpkin or burning of the pumpkin edge on the pan. So I will add the water, and then we're going to put this into our oven at 350 degrees. So what I should have said before I started cutting the pumpkin apart was to go ahead and preheat your oven to 350 degrees. Depending on the size of the pumpkin, you're gonna wanna make sure that your racks in your oven are as low as they can go. Sometimes for the extra large pumpkins, I actually have to take out one of the racks so that I can get them very low so that the tops are not close to the heating elements. Not a big deal. You just want to make sure there's some space between the top of the pumpkin and the element in your oven. So I'm gonna grab the water, and I'm just gonna add a little bit of water, not a lot, because you don't want to add a ton of moisture to your pumpkin puree. You actually want to cook some of that moisture out, but this will just help with scorching. And then I'm going to put the baking tray into the preheated oven very carefully so I don't spill the water. And I'm going to let the pumpkin roast for about an hour, and then I'm going to start checking it to see how soft it is. Depending on the size of your pumpkin, you're gonna need to roast it, possibly a little bit longer or a little bit less. So the larger the pumpkin, the longer you're gonna have to roast it. And the best thing to do, especially the first time you roast a pumpkin, is to perhaps set a timer for 30 minutes and then start checking the pumpkin every 15 minutes after that. And as this starts to roast, I will show you what it looks like and how to determine when it's done. So the pumpkin has been in the oven for a half hour. And to check, you can take a fork and poke, and it's still pretty hard. It's really hard to puncture the skin. So it is nowhere near done. So I'll let it go for another 15 minutes and then check it again. This pumpkin, because it's larger, I knew it would take longer, but I just wanted to show you what it looked like after a half hour. If you cook a smaller pumpkin, it may already be starting to get soft, but that's how you start to check, is with a fork to see once it starts to get soft. I will give you another update in 15 minutes. It has been another 15 minutes, so 45 minutes of cooking time total. You can see it's starting to look a little bit different. And now the fork easily, well, easily goes in that one. Not quite so much in that one, but yeah, definitely starting to go in. So it's starting to get soft. You can see some of the liquid starting to cook out. So I'm going to let it go about another 15 minutes so that it's a little bit softer, but that might do it. Different. All right, it has been 15 minutes, so let's see what's going on. Ooh. All right. As soon as you can see. So yeah, definitely nice and soft. Now you can easily stick a fork in, and it is good and soft. And that's what you want. So once it's soft and you can stick a fork in, that means it's done roasting. So what I recommend is, instead of taking the pumpkin out of the oven, at this point, turn your oven off and leave the door open a little bit until it cools, because of all the liquid and it is heavy. You don't want to pull this out of your oven and end up burning yourself or spilling the liquid all over. So I leave my oven door open a little bit and turn the oven off, and then I let it cool in there for about an hour until it's cooled enough that you can handle it. You can safely pull it out of the oven and work on the next steps of processing. So that's the roasting piece, and I will show you here in a little while. Well, in the video it'll be in seconds, but in real life, in about an hour, I will show you the next steps. All right, so I have the roasted pie pumpkin cooled for about an hour. It's still warm, but it's cool enough to handle, and I pulled it out of the oven. The next step is removing the flesh from the skin. And there's a couple ways to do it. You can kind of peel it off with a knife. But what I like to do is scoop it out with a spoon. So you can see it's still steaming a little bit, it's still hot, but cool enough to handle. So what I do is I take a spoon and I just scoop the flesh away from the skin, and you can get right down to the skin and scrape as much of the pumpkin flesh out as you can get without scraping off pieces of the skin. Now, depending on how well done it is, a couple different things can happen. And again, this is super simple. I don't want to overcomplicate it, but I don't want you to panic thinking you did something wrong either. So if it's undercooked, there can be pieces of the flesh that are still a little hard, and they can be tricky to scrape away. And in that case, you can use a knife to peel the skin off. If you've overcooked it, which I have a tendency to do, when you're scraping the flesh off of the skin, some of the skin can kind of flake off and away as well. Not a big problem, because if you run it through a food mill, it'll get a lot of those pieces of skin out, or you can just pick them out. Can make it a little trickier for scooping the flesh off because it falls apart. But again, either way, it's not a big deal. Ideally though, and this one's pretty well a good example, because I can just easily scoop away all the flesh and the skin is still staying intact. So that's what you want, but it's not that tricky to get this. I just wanted to make you aware of those factors there. So the next step, and I'll continue scooping this away, but the next step is running it through a food mill or a food processor to get a good puree consistency. So you can either scoop straight into your food mill, or into a bowl and then transfer it over all at once. I have my food mill here, so I'm gonna just go ahead and scoop right into the food mill. If you do have some flesh that is still pretty firm, perhaps undercooked, that's okay. You can put it in a saucepan on the stovetop and cook it down a little bit more. You just have to do it on a fairly low heat so that you don't scorch it to the pan. But again, if that happens, it's not a big deal. In fact, some people cook theirs down anyway, and that works. I just like to roast mine enough that I can scoop it right out and right into the food processor, or the food mill rather. And you can see this piece here, I've got pretty well, see, it is falling apart. I got this pretty well scraped clean, so I'm gonna set that aside and just continue scraping out as much flesh as I can get. And then you will just run it through your food mill. You can use a food processor. I have done that in the past. Again, just to get that pureed consistency. Once you have all your pumpkin removed from the skin and pureed, the next step is either using it in a recipe or preparing it for storage. So one thing you want to look at is the consistency of your puree. If there's a lot of water, if it seems pretty runny, it might affect your recipe. You want it to be fairly thick and a good puree consistency. If it's too thin, you can either boil it down in a saucepan, careful not to scorch it, to remove some of the liquid, or some people even strain it with cheesecloth. But once you have the desired consistency, you can either use it right away in a recipe or you can store it for later use. I love to can, but unfortunately, it is not safe to can pumpkin puree. So freezing it is gonna be your best option. I like to freeze ours in these wide mouth pint jars. They hold 2 cups, which is the right amount for most pie recipes. And then I use these plastic storage lids, and I can write pumpkin puree and the date right on the lid with a Sharpie. And I've had really good results with freezing them this way. You can also use larger quart jars if you want to freeze enough for 2 pies. But you can also use other storage containers, Ziploc bags, or anything that's freezer safe. But again, using jars is what has worked well for us. So I just measure out 2 cups of the puree. And fill the jars. You do want to make sure you smooth the top down and leave enough room for a little expansion, but I've never had any problems with freezing a jar like this. And that's it. You can continue filling your jars and put them right into the freezer, and then when you're ready to bake a pie or another baked good with the pumpkin. You just get it out of the freezer and let it thaw out completely to room temperature before using it. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope that you give it a try and process your own pie pumpkin. If you have any questions, comment below and let us know. We would be happy to answer any questions or help you work through this so that it's not intimidating anymore. Thank you and God bless.